Let's look at what historically has brought warring nations to the negotiation table. I'm Dr. K. I'm a political scientist, and like in the past, I'm going to take a current event and show you a little bit more to help you better understand the context. Pope Francis said Ukraine should have the courage of the white flag and negotiate with Russia. Negotiations are a part of political science: diplomacy, international relations, conflict resolution, peace studies. Experts study states, organizations, and individuals, their strategies, their tactics, and the processes of negotiation. Many people specializing in history and negotiations will tell you negotiations don't happen unless one side is forced to negotiate. First off, negotiations happen when a clear military defeat forces a nation to surrender. In the past century, where multilateralism, that's nations working together, has been the norm, these negotiations are not with the loser, but more with the alliance members who won. When Germany surrendered unconditionally in May 1945, they had no leverage left. The surrender was quick, but the negotiations for dividing and controlling Germany took a lot longer. Often, a change in leadership or government through elections, coups, or external intervention can alter the course of a conflict. New leaders may be more inclined and feel less personally invested in continuing a conflict, making them more open to negotiate. The 1989 election of F.W. de Klerk as president of South Africa marked a pivotal change in the country's system of apartheid. De Klerk's willingness to engage in dialogue was critical to the unbanning of the African National Congress and the release of Nelson Mandela. And while this example is not about two warring countries, when there is unrest or war, many countries have laws that prevent scheduled elections that could lead to changes when martial law or the state of emergency is declared. This means that revolutions, coups, or external interventions are sometimes part of the leadership change which leads to negotiations. But this can lead to questions about the legitimacy of the negotiations later. Another thing that drives nations to negotiate is a stalemate, where neither side can achieve a decisive victory. That might lead both parties to negotiate to avoid a drawn-out and costly war. Going back to World War I on the Western Front, after the initial German advance is a good example of this. Both sides had dug into trenches that extended all the way from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The horrific conditions and the loss of life for just a little territorial gain contributed to the willingness to negotiate. News of horrific conditions is often tied to domestic pressure, public opinion, and internal dissent, and that can influence a government's decision to continue fighting or negotiate. These factors played a significant role for the United States during the Vietnam War. Public opposition to the war, fueled by the draft, high casualty rates, and media coverage, influenced the U.S. decision to eventually negotiate and end its involvement in Vietnam with the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. International diplomacy and the role of third-party nations and international organizations like the United Nations, and yes, religious figures like the Pope, can also be important in mediating peace talks and negotiating settlements. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved through diplomatic negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, with both sides agreeing to remove missiles from Cuba and Turkey, respectively, to avoid a nuclear confrontation. Nations might also decide to negotiate when the geopolitical landscape changes in a way that alters their strategic interest. New threats, shifting alliances, or the realization that continued conflicts is going to undermine their long-term strategic goals. In most science fiction stories, it's the aliens that often unite the world. It's more the idea of your enemy's enemy is your friend. And this was seen in World War II. Despite major ideological differences, the US, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom worked together with others to defeat the Axis powers. But this didn't prevent the Cold War from intensifying afterwards. The development or introduction of new technology or tactics can also drastically change the balance of power in a conflict and lead to negotiations. The U.S. bombing of Hiroshima, Japan is undeniably an example, but hybrid warfare and drone capabilities may soon be new examples of technology that changed power balances. Wherever a war starts, They usually end at the bank. This means the exhaustion of any resources, including military personnel and equipment. When a country can no longer effectively sustain its war effort, they have to negotiate. And this is why some argue that continuing to support Ukraine is only prolonging the war. Academically, international pressure that's related to humanitarian crises caused by conflicts is often listed as another factor that can lead to negotiations. War crimes, genocide, refugees can bring about international condemnation, but this alone does not stop a conflict or bring two warring parties to negotiation. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 made this clear when the international community failed to prevent or stop the genocide against the Tutsi population. And words matter. The United Nations Security Council officially recognized the events in 1994 as genocide. After this, during the Bosnian War, the Kosovo conflict, and the Syrian civil war, condemnation was used in conjunction with diplomatic efforts, economic sanctions, and military intervention. The achievement of lasting peace varies considerably in these examples. And like international pressure, most of the times when countries negotiate, more than one factor is at play. Economic constraints, domestic problems, stalemates, there are always overlapping issues unless there's total defeat. That's why Pope Francis' suggestion that Ukraine enter negotiations, for many, is him telling Ukraine he sees them as a defeated country. Others see Pope Francis using his moral authority in an attempt to reframe negotiations and place the burden of concession on Ukraine. Poland's foreign minister pointed out that if the Pope wants the war to end, he should encourage Putin to withdraw his army from Ukraine, and there'd be immediate peace without the need for any negotiations. As conflicts happen, knowing what brings countries to the negotiation table can help understand how they may end. I'm Dr. K.